Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Today, Brian Stout is back to help me talk about the Apple Macintosh in Chapter 4, Will the Wise. Welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s. I'm joined once again by a friend, colleague, and fellow stranger, Brian Stout. Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Going well.
Awesome.
Excited to be back.
Awesome. So, Brian, what do you know about the Apple Macintosh? Let's start with that.
First thing I think of from the 80s, obviously, is the iconic advertisement. It had a very Orwellian vibe, and someone famous directed it, and I should have looked this up before we started talking.
Ridley Scott.
Yes, there we go.
It was based on the concept of 1984 because it came out in 1984. The ad was for the Super Bowl of that year, and the theme of the ad was 1984, this Orwellian Big Brother sort of preaching conformity, and then you have Apple coming along as the iconoclast trying to save everyone from that conformity. Big Brother represented IBM. Apple was a scrappy little kind of independent technology company that's going to break IBM's stranglehold. Of course, Apple was a pretty big company even at that time.
Yeah, it's really funny to think about that. This idea of, the fabled stories of him building the computer in his garage and all those things.
Which, yeah, you got to take a lot of that with a lot of salt.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, there's the legend and then there's the reality.
Yes.
I've watched, I've seen a doc about him that's a little more even-handed.
Yeah. And so we're talking about Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Yes, Steve Jobs.
So I will admit he was a brilliant business person. Not so much
certainly.
A tech guy. I mean, his strategy was to find people who are really good at creating tech and then kind of sort of not really stealing it from them, but taking credit for it.
Basically just beat them into submission and make sure that they get everything done under budget and on time. And yeah, there's as much as we are, meant to be in awe of Steve Jobs, I'm coming at this from the angle of having studied leadership development and industrial organizational psych and those areas. And Steve Jobs is really not the kind of person that you want to aspire to be as a leader. You may aspire to that level of success, but he's definitely not the kind of guy that you would take the leadership playbook from Steve Jobs and feel good about being a leader of that sort.
I can't remember the exact phrase that he used to describe his style. It was something like managing reality or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is just a nice way of saying gaslighting.
Yeah, basically. When Apple really hit the massive resurgence that it did at the beginning of this century with iPods and iPhones and iPads and everything, there were a lot of stories coming out of Apple, people who had left. And it's not really fair to throw all this at Apple's feet. I mean, the same stories come out of companies like Google and other tech companies too. It seems to be the nature of that culture and that kind of business environment. But a lot of things that, as a person who coaches leaders, trains leaders, works with leaders, I'm never using examples of like Steve Jobs as somebody that I would say, oh, try to be as emotionally intelligent as Steve Jobs, or try to care about your people the way that Steve Jobs does. Yeah, those things never come out of my mouth ever.
Yeah, I mean, he's just, stories we've heard about him. And a lot of this, of course, is kind of like hindsight. And, especially after his death, this stuff comes out. But yeah, not necessarily a nice person. But anyway, the
Yeah.
Macintosh. The Macintosh was the sort of revamping of Apple's computers into what we have today. So when you look at, Macs or MacBooks now, they're a direct line of descent from the Apple Macintosh. What made Macintosh such a big thing?
I think you've already talked about some of it. I really think the branding is one of the major
Mhm.
things. The Apple logo is very iconic. There's that. They used to, and I'm not sure about this. Somebody can probably correct me in the comments or whatever, but my understanding is, at least at the time that I remember getting my first Apple product, was that they had a reputation for being kind of quirky, but definitely better products than like a lot of the things that were out. And they really leaned into that, later on with that "I'm a Mac, I'm a PC" ad campaign, and
Right.
with Justin Long, super cool Justin Long, and dorky John Hodgman,
John Hodgman, yeah.
who looked a little bit like Bill Gates. Of course, that was
Right.
I'm
That
sure
was
that was
the
on
the
purpose.
idea.
Yeah. My recollection of Apple really was just, or Macintosh was really just this ad. And then they just kind of went away because my public schools didn't have those computers. I don't
I
think I
was going
even
to ask
encountered
you
them.
about that. What was your
And
experience with them?
I didn't even encounter an Apple computer until I was in college.
There was the sense that, Macs and Apple computers were better used for like creative projects. So
Yeah.
if you're in art or music, they
Hmm.
were better for that. But if you're doing like word processing or business applications, then you went with a Windows type PC.
Yeah, that rings for me too. That makes sense.
So yeah, I mean, I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, and this is far enough back that personal computers were still relatively new and something that were being introduced into schools. So yeah, they had Apple computers, and I think they were the Apple IIs, possibly Macintosh, although Macintosh, and part of the problem, let's put problem in air quotes here, is that Apple products tend to be much more expensive.
Yeah.
And that was definitely true of the Macintosh and the Apple PCs or personal computers, as they were much more expensive than what you had with IBM or other companies at the time. But the idea was, yeah, they're more expensive, but they're worth it. You're paying for the quality.
That is the thing that kind of pushed me. I think one final like Windows based laptop crashing in the middle of graduate school was what really finally pushed me over the edge and made me buy my first like iMac.
And I
Because there was a
remember,
compatibility issue there too for a while. I think that
yeah,
was the other thing. Like they didn't have, I think that was the thing that usually kept me away, I think, for quite a while, was that they didn't mess with like MS Office or things like that. And then they
exactly.
finally started to, and I think that was the tipping point for me.
So really the big innovation of Apple Macintosh is it wasn't the first computer to use a GUI, but it really made the GUI popular. Do you know what a GUI is?
I don't.
A GUI, the graphical user interface. So prior to that, computers used text-based interfaces. So if you wanted to open a program, you'd have to type in a command code to open that product, and everything was text-based. The Macintosh popularized the idea of using icons or pictures representing the different features, the different applications, or the different commands. So you could just click on the picture and open in order to open the program. If you wanted to like save your work, you would click on the save icon and stuff like that. So yeah, the idea of icons and graphics as a means of interacting with a computer, that was really what Macintosh did. That was one of the big innovations. And now every computer just about relies very heavily on that GUI, that graphical user interface. And so that was, like I said, it was the innovation of the day, and it has really kind of had a profound impact on computers that we use now. And of course, if it wasn't for the success of the Macintosh, you wouldn't have smartphones now, or not as we know them, not as we have them, or MP3 players, because it was Apple that really drove the innovation into that technology. How do we see that represented in Stranger Things, do you think? Kind of obliquely, very subtly. There is
very subtle, because I don't even remember. I remember my first thought was just the ad, because I remember the 1980. I remember knowing the year this series is set in.
Right. The Apple Macintosh, though, is represented here naturally because, our group of heroes, our younger group of heroes, are AV kids. So they're kind of tech geeks. And in the AV room, there is a poster for Apple Macintosh. So, like I said, it's very subtle. It's easy to overlook, but it is represented in our series. And that takes us,
should be there.
Yes. And that takes us into chapter 4, Will the Wise. So what do you think about this episode, Brian?
Well, I was joking with you earlier, and I said, oh, it's all about Will. It always comes back to Will. It's always Will. Will. There's some really interesting things that come out in this that there's some funny, like, allusions to some other movies. There's, if it was set a little later, there's some things that I would say are certainly meant to be nods to movies that would come out in a couple of years or so.
Okay.
There's some really weird things with Billy's character that seem to come out a little bit in this too, that they're sort of alluding to some ideas that he might have.
Well, let's talk about that, because is Billy racist? What do you think? I mean,
that's certainly one way to read the scene where he's in the car with Max and he's like, says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something to the effect of, like, that's the kind of person you don't want to be around.
Exactly.
Right, yeah. And he's like, I'm, now that you're part of my family, I'm meant to protect you. It's a really shitty, like, Midwest white guy thing to say about a black person. That is unfortunately very on brand for that time frame.
Right. And it's kind of unclear exactly what's going on there. I mean, he clearly doesn't like Lucas, but is that because, Lucas is becoming friendly with his stepsister, whom he doesn't like anyway? Or is it because of Lucas's race? It's not explicitly explained or addressed head on, but we have seen in this season a little bit more racial tension happening. We see it when Mike and Lucas get into an argument about who gets to be Venkman for Halloween. And Mike's attitude was, well, you need to be Winston. And why? Because I'm black? So we do get subtle hints or signs of racism, although it's not directly addressed. And so, my reaction to that scene with Billy is, that feels really racist to me.
And as a current resident of Indiana, unfortunately, it felt pretty on brand for me once you get outside of the little blue bubble that I'm in.
And so I wonder just how Midwestern our reactions are to that. Would people in other parts of the country see it the way that we do?
I feel like they would, because I think that we have, I don't think that the Midwest has cornered the market on racism, for one thing. I think that,
certainly parts of the country are worse.
Oh, for sure.
Have a reputation for being worse. Let's put it that way.
And then the areas of the country that, would like to think that they're more enlightened are probably fooling themselves to a degree. So I think that, my first reaction to that is really just that I think that we've seen enough, I hate to say it, but we've seen enough shows where this is kind of like, well, this cue is meant to sort of make you go and your thinking
right
shift about this character, because it's really the first time you've seen him say or do something like that. And it feels, I mean, he hadn't really ever made any other comments that made you feel that way, or that like tipped off that hat to this point, other than
Although we
now.
have seen so far, he's been depicted as really kind of a shitty douchebag.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, he's a total asshole,
Right.
100%.
And in fact, it's in this episode where he shows a little misogyny, and that during the
Yeah,
shower scene, he's like,
yeah,
there's so many bitches in the sea. I'll try to leave you some. He says to Steve.
yeah, yeah. In the boys' shower, no less. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, my thought on that, it made me think of the basketball sequence before this made me think a little bit of like Top Gun, which
Yeah.
I know is a little ahead of, it's not meant to happen or it doesn't happen for a couple more years.
Right.
Um, but then also,
But there is that
and
sort of raging testosterone aspect to
yeah,
it.
and then there's this whole bit in the shower which kind of reminded me of like a reverse gender Carrie to a degree.
Ah, interesting.
Which I know that they are definitely down with, making some
Yes.
Stephen King references all over this thing. And yeah, then that misogyny comes out. It really does track for his character, being like that he looks like he's, in an 80s metal band or something.
Mhm.
And, there's a lot of, actually it's funny because there's a lot of like stuff that you look at now with like, our eyes now and go like, wow, that looks really, really gay to me. Like not in a derogatory way, but like just very like
Sort of homoerotic.
yeah, homoerotic, that's the word, right? And then so there's that, but then it's also paired with this misogyny. It's almost like there's this message of like, we're going to put on all this makeup and stuff, but then we're going to say horrible things about women, so that we're not, like those guys.
So yeah, the misogyny it seems more blatant here than the racial aspect. So why do you think they don't explicitly discuss race here or make him explicitly racist?
I think that, I mean, there's a couple of different things I can think of. I think one is that, these characters in this town don't encounter a lot of people who aren't like them.
Uh-huh.
And so that it's not, it could be that maybe that's about as explicit as they can go in terms of like being, like that's the way their racism shows.
Yeah, but I mean
because it bubbles up.
other shows today, even those which are, set in the 1980s, they're more upfront about dealing with issues of race. Stranger Things feels squeamish.
Yeah, I was gonna say I have never, I haven't looked. I'd love to see what the Duffer Brothers, if someone, I'm sure someone has asked them questions about how they handle racial matters on the show. They do seem pretty squeamish about it. It's interesting. You bring up a good point because it feels as though they're more comfortable, portraying that really overt misogyny than really handling the racial matters. And that I know there's any number of possible explanations that I could just throw out there, like maybe maybe Netflix is mandating that. It could be that this show is so popular and race, like dealing with race in a way that makes some people uncomfortable, could really alienate big chunks of that audience.
Okay.
That could be part of it, whereas we're a little more, it's, it doesn't sound cool to say, but I guess we're a little more used to like talking about misogyny, or a little more comfortable talking about that than race.
But not just misogyny. Issues of homosexuality, they're more frank about that in the show. Both positive and negative.
Yeah. It could have to do with the fact that the Duffer Brothers are white and they just don't really know what to do with how to do that effectively, and they didn't get a consultant or somebody to talk them through how to do it.
Interesting.
Well,
I hadn't considered that because if you look at the the producers of the show and the showrunners, it is a pretty, it's a white cast, predominantly white cast, but also predominantly white crew, or at least that's the impression that I get.
Yeah.
So maybe they're just not comfortable dealing with it themselves.
Demography. Sometimes, and sometimes in situations like this, they're just like, I hate to say it, there are a lot of white people who are pretty clueless about shit like this, and they just don't.
Yes,
It just doesn't really register with them that they should be handling this a
that is
little more
true.
carefully.
That is true.
And my best guess would be that by the time this season was happening, the show is a pretty big juggernaut now. They
Hmm.
probably are pretty careful about wanting to. They're going to be careful to not alienate any of the audience. And I
Okay.
think that sometimes white people get really uncomfortable if a show starts to deal with race. Like if you think about, like, I was about to say this earlier when we were talking about the Midwest not cornering the market on racism. There's some really interesting stuff in Atlanta that deals with race a lot, and that's a show that I think that doesn't have a huge audience, but was really well critically received.
Right.
It's probably on most people's list of like best shows of this century. It should be if it's not. But that's a black cast and crew,
Yeah.
or a multiracial crew. Hiro Murai directed a lot of the episodes, writes them with Donald Glover and his brother. It's a show that is meant to be provocative and make people feel uncomfortable, specifically white people. I think
Right.
in the third season, it's got some really cool Twilight Zone stuff in it.
And of course, it is created from a sort of Black or African American perspective, speaking to themes important to that demographic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think those are all really good points. Also, I kind of get the sense that they don't want Billy to come off as being too much of a bad guy, that they want to give him a sort of opportunities for redemption the way Steve had the opportunities for redemption in the first season. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. He does seem kind of like a worse iteration of Steve.
It very
Like
much
it.
so. I mean, everything that we associated with Steve in the first season, Billy takes it farther.
Yeah,
Right?
he takes it to 11 to use another 1984
Yeah,
appropriate reference.
absolutely. Absolutely. It takes it to
Yeah,
11.
where's the Spinal Tap in this? God, they really missed that opportunity. Man, that should be all over this thing.
So, other thoughts or things you want to discuss about this episode?
Well, there's this really absurd needle drop of using the song from Scarface in the midst of that basketball game,
Right.
which
So,
is
Paul
you've got
Engelman's Scarface, Push It to the Limit.
Yes, Welcome to the Limit, I think is the line that's like the last song of the show. It's in this I really don't know what the hell they were thinking putting that song in there in that particular moment, because in the movie, in Scarface, it's the point where Tony's starting to really stack some paper and his coke empire is really growing, and it's one of the like most fun and 80s and exciting sequences in that film. But it's like it just didn't. I'm like, why is this in the basketball game? Are these guys? Did the guys do coke before they started playing? Everybody's got their shirt off. I don't know. Maybe it's like
Billy's pushing it to the limit. He's taking it to 11.
Yeah. Well, that's actually that was one. I think that is actually a moment when they were trying to make Billy a little bit nicer, because he does give Steve a tip
In a really kind of douchebag way,
in a condescending, shitty way. But he was kind of like, if you plant your feet, like then you can take the charge. Basically. It's funny that this guy with that hair and that outfit is the hyper masculine guy on the show. It sort of cracks me up. Like, and I'm also thinking, like, I mentioned earlier that I live in Indiana currently. I'm thinking about what the reaction to this dude might have been in like 1984. He's probably the only guy in town that's dressed like this, and like it's kind of amusing to me to think about.
Interesting, yeah.
Like what he might have been.
I mean,
what he's dealing with when he's not on camera.
And when we do first see him, and he makes his grand entrance with his Trans Am and the music cranked up, and everyone's like checking him out, especially the young ladies who are very interested in him. That really does single him out as being an outsider within this community. And that is one of our recurring themes in the show, about stranger things, about strangers, people who are outsiders. So he does kind of fit the mold of the rest of our characters in his own way.
Yeah, that's true.
So going back to music, there are two significant featured songs here. So we get that Scarface song, and then we get the Clash making a return with This Is Radio Clash, which we only hear very briefly.
Yeah, that's from Sandinista, which is like their victory lap, like their triple album. It's when they were packing arenas. It's from a couple years before this episode aired.
Yes,
I looked it up. I
1981.
think it's 82 or 81.
81, yep.
It's 81?
Yep.
What year was London Calling then? Is that 1980?
I want to say 1980. That feels right.
Must have been 1980 because this was Sandinista is definitely after London Calling.
Yeah.
So London Calling must have been 1980. Wow, it's crazy to think that those two came out like right on the heels of each other. That's a very fertile creative period for them. So it's that jumped out at me, of course. It's Jonathan listening to it because Jonathan's definitely the person with the best music taste on the show.
Generally speaking, although you gotta enjoy some of those pop songs though.
Oh sure, but like he has the coolest music taste. How about that?
Okay.
He's the guy he's like the edgy guy, the edgiest music taste. He's the guy with the Joy Division and the New Order,
right?
The Clash and the Cure and all the cool stuff.
Yeah. And looking at it now, it's all cool, but yeah, at the time,
right? Yeah, and that happens when. Let's see, that's when Jonathan and Nancy go off on their little adventure.
Yes.
Which has a really fun little surprise twist at the end when she pulls out the cassette out of her purse, and
which was set up in the previous episode, and she gets the idea to, get a tape recorder so that she can get some evidence against the government, the G-men, to get justice for Barb. Yeah. We talked before about the previous season being a metaphor for cancer because we get a lot of cancer symbolism and imagery throughout the entire season. This season seems to be a metaphor for trauma, though. And we've talked about trauma and PTSD several times already in the second season here. Are you picking up on that, or what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, this season has the fallout of everything that happened previously. So there's clearly going to be a lot of allusions to trauma or people dealing with things, like the fallout of what's occurred, trying to wrestle with how to get past it or manage it.
Talked about quite obviously with Will, and I think maybe that's why this is all about Will and Will the Wise. But of course, we do see Nancy dealing with trauma as well and losing Barb and having feelings of survivor's guilt. Hopper talks about his trauma as well and seeing trauma from Vietnam veterans, but also, having lost a child himself.
Well, and then actually, that's interesting that you mentioned that in this particular episode. There's actually a pretty, 11 has that weird dream sequence flashback, or not flashback, but like that weird sequence where she's, encounters her mother.
Yeah.
And she's also,
very much.
And before that is actually, you could certainly interpret her misbehavior and her her fight with Hopper as, her processing some trauma as well.
Yeah.
Like she's,
how can it not be?
Yeah.
But also her mother, Terry Ives, extreme trauma there. What's going on between 11 and Hopper here? She says, "You are like Papa."
Part of it is that he's trying to protect her, but she reads that as her trying to just like, keep her captive to a degree.
Yeah.
Like the fight begins because she has potentially been seen, or she's been seen by, someone out. And he's trying to hide her and keep her under the radar so she doesn't have to go, so she doesn't wind up getting found out and dragged back to Papa. So it's, it's not at all surprising that is the way she feels about it, given her age. She's probably, at a place where she's like, understands it enough for it to be annoying to her.
Right. She does feel like she's imprisoned here, the way she was in the lab.
Yeah.
Also, she was raised in a way that was very abusive and wasn't really taught how to like communicate feelings in a way that is going to be conducive to communication. On top of that, now she is moving into adolescence.
Yeah. And on
So
top of that, she also has a parent figure who is also similarly struggling with processing and communicating feelings. Because
exactly,
Hopper has got his whole own host of, he hides a lot of it under his sort of like sarcastic,
exactly. I think there's
kind
a
of
lot of
bravado, but there's
similarity
a
between
lot of,
these two.
yeah, and that's why they're struggling, I think, with each other,
Yeah.
because there is some, they're both dealing with some very difficult things. I mean, you also, got Hopper with, he's sort of in this position because he's trying to like redeem himself over his daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and then also, you know, protect her, but he's got his own problems and he's
Yeah.
seen some weird things now at this point as well,
I've seen
so
some shit, man.
yeah. So not only, I mean, he's got Vietnam, he's got all the shit that happened in episode or series one, and now he's got this, and he's just trying to like, you know, do the right thing here, but
Yeah.
it's very difficult. And he, just like a lot of parents, especially in the 80s, he isn't well equipped to, we weren't
Yes.
talking about things like, you know, the kinds of parenting articles and resources that I'm
Mm-hmm.
reading now to try to not be like Hopper with my own kids. Um, there's just the dialogue that is occurring is very different, and we've talked about that
Yes.
several times. So there's just a lot of barriers here. They're
Yeah.
both really, and I think that they're both responding to those barriers in a way that is, the only way they know how. It's just
Yes.
definitely not healthy or
Yeah.
productive. But no, they're not. It's not like they're going to go see a therapist or something.
Glenn and I talked a little bit about this last time about how with Hopper and Eleven, they're they really have difficulties communicating. Eleven has difficulties with communication because she wasn't taught how to communicate effectively. Hopper is, you get the sense that he's just sort of emulating the kind of communication that he received from his father or his parents.
Yeah.
And so they are, I mean, they both essentially are trying to accomplish the same thing. He wants her to be safe and ultimately to uh, have a normal childhood, which is really what she wants, but they're not able to explain their perspectives to each other. And you get
Yeah.
a sense here, especially in this episode, after they have that big argument, Hopper tries to apologize, but he doesn't know how.
Yeah, I know. I was going to bring that up because he starts to say something that
Mm-hmm.
makes it sound like he's going to apologize, and
Yeah.
then he shifts it over to like this place is. He asked her to
Yep.
make sure she cleans something
Yeah.
up. I can't remember
I
what
want
it
this place
was.
cleaned up by the time I get home.
Yeah. So it's. I mean, I think like I gotta say. I mean, as a parent, these sequences, unfortunately, I mean, they do really resonate for me. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
they could resonate for anybody because we've all been parented by someone. But
Right.
now having the other job, so to speak, like it does make my heart hurt a little bit to see him trying to like wanting to do better, but not having the way to do it.
Yeah.
And it does make me think a lot about like how that how that could have been for people. I mean, now we're far more open. Lots of people
Mhm.
don't take advantage of these open dialogues and better
Right.
resources that are available even now. But I mean, a lot of the people that I'm around who are parenting, we're looking at different ways to parent altogether. We're not looking at this like rewards and punishment kind of vibe because that's not really how the world works. I mean, I won't go too far on it because I got a lot to say about it, but that'll be my other podcast that I'll start for
Okay.
myself. But mindful parenting or something, I'm working on it. But yeah, I mean, and it reminds me, I mean, and that resonates for me. We're both products of the Midwest. I mean, this is the way a lot of parents that I was around
Yeah.
parented. This is not like, jarring for me to see somebody
Right.
like wanting to do better, but just being like, I really don't know. But just reverting because they don't know the path
Right.
forward.
And that's what I was going to say is, like you said, Hopper is a parent of his time. I mean, that's the way that, especially fathers interacted with their children in the 80s and the 70s and before. Raising the kids was primarily the woman's job.
Yeah.
And, the father was there to be the disciplinarian. And they
Well,
weren't sort of encouraged to express their emotions or their feelings in productive ways.
yeah, I was gonna say, actually, in a weird way, like for this time period, this might have even been like, I wouldn't go so far as to say progressive, but like probably better than what someone would have done in 1964 or
Right.
1954, because it would have just been left to like, he wouldn't have the option of leaving it to his a partner here, but
Exactly.
like it would have just been like, he probably would have just gone to work and said like, I don't know what to do with this kid, and then that's it. Or came home and just sat on the couch with a scotch or something. And
which is kind of what Mike's dad is like. The very sort of
right.
standoffish.
Yeah, we're always harping on him.
How useless he is. That's coming up though. Dustin does talk about how useless he is. But and I think that's why it resonates with us so much, is partly because of our experience growing up in the 80s. We've seen this before, but also it feels realistic. There's a verisimilitude to it that makes it relatable for us, and I think for a lot of people as well. So is he really like Papa?
No.
I mean, from our outside perspectives, no. I mean, we see him as the hero. We understand why he's doing what he does.
Right. But from Eleven's perspective, and certainly in Hopper, surely doesn't feel like that's who he is. But I think you can see how, to try to put yourself in Eleven's shoes, you can certainly see how she would, like if you take it in broad strokes, I'm not allowed to go anywhere. I'm now getting punished for speaking up. I'm not,
I can't get what I want.
I get so frustrated that I use my powers to, to express my anger rather than words. And then I get, punished for doing that. I mean, it all probably doesn't feel too different to her.
Yeah.
I'm being hidden away. Can't see my friends.
And the thing about 11 and her communication style is she's very blunt about things because, again, she hasn't learned those sort of social niceties. But she expresses what she actually thinks and what she actually feels. It just, comes off a bit rough. And like you say, she gets punished for it.
Right. Yeah. And that's partially, I mean, part of it is her audience. I mean, it's also, it's hard to not feel for her too, because, she's just trying to, she senses that something isn't right, and she wants to approach it, but we just don't, a lot of us just don't have the tools for that.
Right.
And it's easier to just try to like ride it out or just leave it alone than to try to exist in an uncomfortable place and try to get your way out of it.
And so when she says you are like Papa, that's true from her perspective.
Yeah.
It makes sense. So yeah, that is how she actually feels. What else is going on in this episode? So we have Will's violation, let's put it that way. Which again goes back to that metaphor for trauma, because when he describes it, how he feels it everywhere, and it's so cold, and he's trying to block it out, but he can't get past it. I think that's a really succinct way of expressing the idea of trauma and PTSD. So we have the Will situation. What else is happening?
Well, that poor cat.
Oh yeah. Poor Muse.
Yeah, I had forgotten that happened. Actually, that was kind of taking me by surprise at the end. So.
I mean, we saw it coming. I mean, how could you not?
Well, I mean, using my 80s movie hat, of course, I knew the cat wasn't going to make it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the person who says, I'm going to go, I'll be right back. Right?
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Like in Scream. Yes.
Yeah.
That sort of trope or cliche. You know, if
Yeah.
you say I'll be right back, you're not going to be back. You're going to die.
Yeah, there was
And then we
that.
have Jonathan and Nancy on their mission.
Mhm.
So again, like in the first season, we have three
Yeah.
different storylines that
Mhm.
are running parallel to each other that will ultimately um, sort of dovetail together and come together.
Yeah, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about something that Paul Reiser's character said,
Uh-huh.
because he uses the statement "mistakes were made," and
Yeah.
I
And I did
could not help but to Google like history of the expression "mistakes were made,"
really.
because I was like, I know this is, I knew
Uh-huh.
this was from 80, because I had a vague recollection of Ronald Reagan saying it, and he did.
Okay.
It actually, the first time anyone said it, at least by a president, I looked up and it said Ulysses S. Grant was the first person to say it. And then Reagan popularized it. And then it's literally been said by anybody from Reagan all the way up through Bush too. I didn't see Obama saying
Okay.
it, but it's possibly did.
Mistakes were made. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a wow. I mean, is there a more like gaslighting phrase to to use for some of the atrocities that we have, brushed off with the mistakes were made?
Right.
Like, I mean,
I mean, it's become
um,
kind of a joke now, the phrase mistakes were made.
yeah, like,
Uh,
Reagan used it in reference to the Challenger disaster, is what I found in my research.
oh, wow.
Which, I mean, is so like it's very on brand for him, but and just really highlights that appalling. And then Bush one had used it related to the Iraq War. Bush two used it also related to the Iraq War. Let's see what other. Oh, Clinton used it also. Bush two also used it around Katrina.
Okay.
So I mean, come on, like that is
Yeah,
uh,
horrific things happen. Yeah,
yeah,
mistakes were made.
yeah. As a
It is kind of
my bad.
a way of understating something. Yeah.
Oh my God, it's appalling. I mean, to even yet another whole thing I could go off on for a minute is the whole Katrina deal. If that's something that is interesting to you, there's a really great documentary that Spike Lee made called "When the Levees Broke," that I bet you can stream on HBO Max. It's
Awesome.
infuriating, it's appalling, it's very moving.
So yeah, I picked up on that scene as well, not necessarily that exact phrase. Yeah, so Dr. Owens, Paul Reiser, quotes George Sarton. And I didn't really know who George Sarton was. I had to look him up. He was a scientist and historian who sort of founded the discipline of the history of science. And so the quotation is, men of science have made abundant mistakes of every kind. There are a few phrases in this particular episode that I feel like are really kind of spot on, or they're maybe a little too on the nose. So that is an
Mhm.
example where Paul Reiser quotes George Sarton and says, "You know who he was? It doesn't matter. Mistakes were made." And then this is a pretty big mistake when he shows Jonathan and Nancy the gate that is still open.
Mhm.
And he says that, my job is to prevent a foreign power, let's say the Soviet Union, from
Yeah.
learning about this, because what if they didn't think it was a mistake? What if they tried to do this to replicate this on their own?
Mhm.
Which is a bit of foreshadowing, because once we get to season
Yeah.
3,
Mhm.
that's essentially what happens.
Yeah.
But he says it's my job to prevent that from happening, in any way possible, or I'm not sure the exact phrase, but at any cost.
Mhm.
So there is
He
that
also,
threat implied.
yeah, and before that, he also makes it clear that he was brought in to clean up the mess. I believe
Yes.
that's exactly what he says, if I remember
Yes.
correctly.
Yeah, those people who made those mistakes, they're gone, and I'm here to clean up the mess. This, I think, contributes to our distrust of this particular character. I mean, for those of us, and I've mentioned this before, those of us who grew up in the 80s, who knew Paul Reiser from Aliens, were already suspect of him anyway.
Yeah.
And this, the threat he makes, the veiled threat here in this particular scene, just sort of confirms our suspicions. So
Yeah. Well, I didn't trust him from, and that continued on through Mad About You also. Like I just felt like anytime I see that guy, I just don't trust it.
okay.
Poor Helen Hunt.
Yeah. Some other phrases that stand out. Mr. Clark in the science class talks about all living things instinctively respond to danger, and talks about the fight or flight instinct and how we define fear. And of course, that's what feels really sort of on the nose, because we're seeing that in relation to Will. Joyce has drawn a bath for him, and he says that, it's too hot. And you do get a sense that, he's afraid of it because we know that he's been possessed, or that, he has been altered in some way by this shadow monster. And he says he likes it cold, which is, I think, a callback to the first episode of this season when Dr. Owens is interviewing Jonathan, or excuse me, interviewing Will. And Will says that, when he had this experience of seeing the shadow monster in the arcade, that he felt frozen. And Dr. Owens asks, frozen how? Do you mean like, physically frozen and cold? And so we have that sort of through line, I guess, here, that the Upside Down is a cold place, and this creature likes it cold, and that becomes a key to defeating him later on. Also, I think in relation to this particular episode, when Dr. Owens is making that threat to Jonathan and Nancy, it's when one of his soldiers is using a flamethrower to kill the incursion from the Upside Down, which becomes a big issue in the next particular episode. Other points of dialogue that are important. Lucas says to Max, "Trust me." So that theme of trust, which has permeated the show throughout the first season, is coming back again. We've seen a couple instances where that phrase, "trust me," or some version of it, some variation of it, has been spoken in earlier episodes in this season, but that comes back around. Trust me, as another a restatement of that dominant theme. And then another thing that I think is interesting is at the end of the episode, when Hopper is digging down into the tunnels and he realizes what Will is drawing when he's trying to express these now memories, as he calls them. The camera turns upside down to indicate that Hopper is in the Upside Down. Or Hopper's metaphorically in the Upside Down, and the camera literally turns upside down to signify that. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, yeah, like you said, the trust and, friends don't lie. Like those.
Oh
those are
yeah,
all
friends
like
don't lie.
repetitive. Yeah, all repetitive things. You know what jumped out at me when I was thinking, and this is not quite where maybe where we were thinking about going next, but I'm thinking a little bit about why Lucas is I mean, I know to a degree why Lucas is the one stuck, like, making, like excluding Max or explaining the exclusion of Max. But there's something kind of weird and shitty about that, even though, where, if you've seen further ahead, things are going to go in a certain direction. But like, they also left him to have to sort that out. Like,
yeah,
it's
he's the
kind of
one who had to
shitty
go through the trash too.
Yeah, like there's just some really weird, like, it's what I would call, and I think some other researchers have called it good old fashioned racism, where it's not like this really overt, like I'm going to use the N word and say something horrific or gauche, but I do things in a way that demonstrates some level of racism that
A microaggression.
Yeah, that's what we would call it now, is a microaggression. But like, yeah, it's interesting that Lucas is the one who has to explain this, and and exclude the other person who is a non-white boy from this adventure as a means of protecting her, which is another weird layer to put him in the position of having to, like, putting him in the role of, like,
interesting,
armchair misogynist a little bit, or like act out the misogyny of these other characters.
That's a good point, because I mean, Max does say, "Why can't you tell me? Could you tell L about it?" And he's
Right.
like, "Well, that was just different. Trust me, that was different."
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, well, because it's, they see her as like a peer. They see Elle as like an equal,
Hmm.
but what makes her an equal? She's otherworldly. She's actually like superior to them.
Right.
She can do things that they can't. So it's kind of an interesting comment on, unfortunately, the way that lots of, white boys were thinking,
Yeah.
probably now still, unfortunately, but like in the 80s in particular, it was probably less likely to be called out or seen as misogyny, but
Hmm.
it still is. I mean, the fact that we weren't, as equipped to call it out, it doesn't
Right.
mean it wasn't happening. So,
So yeah, I
yeah, it's
mean,
interesting. I was gonna say, yeah, it just occurred to me. I was looking at that and I thought, that is really,
yeah, I mean,
that's really shitty.
Max
They're not very good to Lucas.
or Max, yeah, and
Yeah,
Max seems to be thinking it's because of her gender, because she's a
right.
girl, that she's being excluded.
Yeah. Well,
Lucas,
and
I mean,
there's even a little undercurrent of that all the way through this season because there's,
mhm,
remembering S1 or E1 where, they assume Mad Max is a one is not a, they would
right,
assume it's like they didn't
it's a
think it was
dude,
her.
right?
Yeah, they're like, oh, what,
Because
who's
girls
good at
don't play
video
video
games?
games. Yeah,
Exactly. Who's good at video games? Boys.
right.
Who would have seen Mad Max? A boy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, and you do kind of feel for Lucas here too, because he legally can't explain to Max what the situation is, right? As much as he wants to,
Hmm.
and that's creates that rift between the two of them.
Yeah.
So yeah, Lucas is just in a bad spot. That's true. That's a
Yeah.
good point.
I mean, it feels very much, I guess in that sense, we were kind of um, spitballing that maybe they're kind of clueless about how racial dynamics work. But
Hmm.
I don't know. The more we talk about this piece, the more I feel like maybe they understand it a little better than we gave them credit for initially.
Well, you really can't see any of the other characters being in Lucas's position here, though, because uh, Dustin is, hiding Dart from the others, even though he is attracted to Max. He can't. He has his own secrets that are legitimately shady, ultimately. And then
Hmm.
Mike really doesn't like Max anyway. He would just tell her to go away and stay away without being
Hmm.
sympathetic about it. So I think, Lucas probably is the best character in this situation to be put in that situation. It's just
Yeah.
coincidentally he's black as well. But that does lead into the Billy situation and
Yeah.
catching Billy's attention. So there is that racial component to it. Huh,
Yeah. I
interesting. I'm
mean,
not
it's,
sure.
yeah.
That could really go either way.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's hard to tell whether I mean, just given the way that they are focused so heavily on the way that they exquisitely craft all these details of the
Yeah.
story in surface of the story,
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna bet it's probably more that than them trying to like make a statement about racism or misogyny for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. But it is still there.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what's confusing is it accidental or not?
Yeah.
And for the most part, like you say, they craft this show so well with intent and purpose that it feels
Yeah.
difficult to be accidental.
Yeah. Well, they're so devoted to the period accuracy that I think my assumption is that they probably felt more like that was more important than maybe even, I don't know. I do sometimes feel like things like race and gender sort of have a afterthought-ish vibe in this series, but I think for
Mm,
some of those reasons we talked about earlier, where they don't really want to go too hardcore on it because they don't want to alienate anybody, and this is a pretty big juggernaut property, and they don't want to get to a place where people are like, I really thought Stranger Things was cool until they started talking about sexism
Started
or
talking about
racism.
politics, and that made
Yeah,
it
then
really.
because
Why do
God,
they have
we
to
all
bring
know how that
politics
goes.
into it? Yeah.
Whoa, because we know how that goes, especially with that fan crowd, man. Oh
Mm.
my goodness. Change the race of one of the characters, everybody has a meltdown. I don't want a black little mermaid. Who gives a shit? It's a mermaid.
They're just trying to be woke now, man.
Uh no. Put yourself in the shoes of a little 5-year-old black girl. Like, shouldn't she get to see people like her? I think so. I'd want to see more people with disabilities. I mean, that's
Sure.
like, you know,
I mean, personally, I think it makes for more interesting stories. But
yeah. I mean, I like, to me, it feels like it's the smartest thing to do because you can cast the net even wider. Like, if I'm going to be even more invested in these folks because they're like me,
Mhm.
then I'm going to, then I'm going to be more into it.
Right.
So why not have more people who aren't just like you and I in these roles and in these shows?
Some of the illusions in this episode. Cheers is on the TV when Hopper
Miss that too. Oh.
pulls the plug out. Not sure what that's about, or why they allude to Cheers, other than the fact that it was a really popular TV show at the time. There was the Macintosh poster, as we've identified, and then Indiana Jones. Did you get an Indiana Jones vibe here? I mean, it's not explicitly referenced.
You're gonna have to spoil it for me. I can't remember.
So when Hopper is digging into the tunnels, of course, he's got his hat on, which is very much an Indiana Jones profile.
Okay.
And also just the idea of him digging. To me, is very reminiscent of Raiders of the Lost Ark, especially the scene where he's, digging up the map room, and you get a scene of him
Yeah.
in profile against the sun and against the sky. When I saw that, I'm like, wow, that feels very Indiana Jones. So I'm pretty sure that was deliberate.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hopper's kind of our Harrison Ford-ish guy in the show.
Mhm.
So not Blade
Okay.
Runner Harrison Ford.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other points you want to talk about? Because that's all I had.
I think that's everything I have in my notes. This episode kind of, it doesn't feel like a ton happens in some ways, but there's a lot of interesting little things going on in it.
I think, yeah, and I felt this a little bit with the last episode and a little bit with the next episode too. They're not filler. They're helping to develop the characters more, so they're important to the story, but you also get a sense that there's not a whole lot that's happening, not a lot of forward momentum.
Yeah, it ultimately does enrich the series quite a bit because these other little pieces are, they're the things that those of us who really like to dig into this stuff really enjoy, like these little nuances of
Right.
getting to know the characters when they're not just pushing the story forward. So it's good, it's solid character work from everybody, I think.
Yes. So these are more character pieces than plot pieces. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, then. So next time, like I said, we're going to be talking about aliens and how that connects to Stranger Things. So many ways. Aliens is really one of the foundational text for this particular season. So we will see many, many parallels. So anything else to add?
No, I don't think so.
Anything you want to promote?
Not really. I've just been lull. I wrote an article that was just published on the Writer. You can find it online. Actually, this one is. Oh yeah, now that I think about it.
Yeah, I just saw you post this.
Yeah, if you're a fan of the White Lotus, I don't happen to be, but and it'll become very clear as you read the article. But I wrote an article about this trend that I'm seeing, that we're all kind of seeing, of like this eat the rich thing that's going on lately. So it's actually continuing even past what I wrote. But I picked out White Lotus and then the film Triangle of Sadness, and then also The Menu, which is probably the most, other than White Lotus, probably the most popular amongst those. But the trend just continues on. There's even more stuff. In fact, the movie I just alluded to earlier that I saw, Infinity Pool, has some similarities too, thematically. But there's an article about that in the Writer, so you can find it online. and read
Awesome.
about it and hiss at me if you'd like the White Lotus. But
And isn't it the cover story?
it is indeed, yes, yeah.
Awesome.
I didn't want to bring that up myself, but since you mentioned it,
I will toot your horn for you.
well, thank you.
Okay. So thanks for joining me again, Brian.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks to everyone for listening. And as always, take it easy, take care, and stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.